I never sued my neighbor, I never yelled across a fence, and I never touched a single board of what he built. But 6 weeks after he decided part of my backyard belonged to him, I stood on my deck drinking coffee, while city contractors loaded the remains of his brand-new building into a trailer and hauled it away piece by piece. The funny thing is, none of this started with a fight. It started with something so small, I almost ignored it completely. My name is Ethan Mercer, and at the time I lived in a quiet neighborhood outside Cedar Ridge, a growing town where people smiled when they passed each other and pretended property disputes only happened in movies. My backyard backed up to another lot separated by grass, old shrubs, and a row of aging maple trees. There had never been a fence between us. For years, nobody seemed to care exactly where one property ended and another began. Then a guy named Brandon Hale bought the house behind mine. At first, Brandon seemed normal enough. Friendly smile, firm handshake, always talking about improvements. The kind of guy who somehow managed to mention his future plans in every conversation. New patio, new landscaping, new workshop, bigger outdoor entertaining area. Every discussion felt like listening to someone narrate a home renovation show. I didn't dislike him. If anything, I admired his energy. Then one Monday morning, I walked outside carrying a trash bag and nearly dropped it. A brand new 6-foot cedar fence stretched across the back of our properties. Fresh wood, straight lines, clean posts. The thing looked like it had appeared overnight. I stood there for a minute staring at it. The lumber still smelled fresh. At first, I assumed Brandon had built it on his side. It wasn't my project, so I shrugged and moved on. Honestly, I probably would have forgotten about it completely if my lawn guy hadn't said something later that week. His name was Miguel. He'd been maintaining my yard for years. As he loaded equipment into his truck, he glanced toward the fence and said, "You know your property goes farther back than that, right?" I laughed. "Pretty sure the line is around those trees." Miguel shook his head slowly. "Maybe, but I've always thought your lot runs deeper than that." It was such a casual comment, but it stuck in my head all day. That evening I dug through a filing cabinet in my office and pulled out the paperwork from when I bought the house. Most homeowners probably never look at those documents after closing. I certainly hadn't. But as I unfolded the plat map across my desk, something immediately caught my attention. The property line wasn't where I thought it was. In fact, according to the documents, my lot extended noticeably beyond the tree line. I studied the measurements twice, then 3 times. Suddenly that fence didn't look so innocent anymore. Still, I wasn't angry. Not even close. Property boundaries get misunderstood all the time. Old owners give bad information. Land markers disappear. People make mistakes. So the next afternoon, I walked over to Brandon's house. He was pressure washing his driveway when I approached. "Hey," I said. "Quick question about the fence." He shut off the machine and smiled. "Looks good, doesn't it?" "It does," I admitted. I was checking some old property paperwork, and I think the boundary might actually be a little different than we thought. Maybe we should double-check it sometime. Brandon didn't look concerned. Not even slightly. He wiped his hands on a towel and said, "The previous owner told me the line was right around there." "Could be," I said. "Just figured it wouldn't hurt to verify." "Sure," he replied. "No problem." The conversation couldn't have gone smoother. No tension. No argument. No attitude. I walked home thinking we'd probably get it sorted out in a week or 2. Except nothing happened. Days turned into weeks. The fence stayed exactly where it was. Brandon never brought it up again. Every time I looked out my kitchen window, I found myself staring at it a little longer. Then something happened that changed everything. One Friday afternoon, a delivery truck backed into Brandon's yard carrying what looked like the pieces of a large prefab workshop. Workers unloaded wall panels, roofing materials, pallets of gravel, and construction supplies. I watched from my deck as they spent the entire weekend assembling it. By Sunday evening, there was a massive structure standing behind the fence. It wasn't some temporary garden shed. This thing had a foundation, electrical wiring, lighting, and enough room to park equipment inside. It was permanent. And as I stood there looking at it, a feeling settled into my stomach that I couldn't shake. If the fence was where I thought it was, then part of that building wasn't sitting on Brandon's property at all. It was sitting on mine. And for the first time since this whole thing started, I realized this might not be a misunderstanding anymore. That realization kept me awake most of the night. Not because I was worried about losing a few feet of grass, but because something about the timing felt wrong. The fence had gone up first. Then the workshop appeared almost immediately afterward. It felt planned, deliberate, like somebody wanted to establish a new reality before anyone asked questions. Monday morning, I called a licensed survey company. The estimate made me wince a little, but I approved it anyway. A few weeks later, a survey crew arrived carrying tripods, measuring equipment, fluorescent paint, and stacks of markers. I remember standing outside with a cup of coffee watching them work while trying not to imagine the outcome. Part of me still hoped I was wrong. Life would be easier if I was wrong. Around noon, one of the surveyors approached me with a clipboard. He didn't look surprised. He looked like a man delivering information he'd delivered 1,000 times before. "We've completed the measurements," he said. "Your property line is significantly beyond the fence." Then he pointed. Bright orange stakes marked the true boundary. The fence crossed onto my property by nearly 8 feet. The workshop crossed by more than 5. I walked the entire line myself. Every marker confirmed the same thing. For several minutes, I just stood there staring at those little orange flags fluttering in the breeze. There's a strange difference between suspecting something and proving it. Suspicion creates questions. Proof removes them. I took photographs from every angle. Then I printed copies of the survey and sent one to Brandon along with a polite note. I didn't threaten him. I didn't accuse him of anything. I simply explained what the survey showed and suggested we resolve the issue before it became expensive for both of us. Days passed. No response. Then a week passed. Still nothing. What I got instead was something almost insulting. One Saturday afternoon, I looked out my window and saw Brandon carrying patio chairs into the disputed area. Not near it. Directly into it. He arranged them beside a new fire pit. A few days later, he added decorative lights. Then potted plants. It looked less like a mistake and more like an attempt to establish ownership through confidence. Eventually, I caught him outside and tried again. "Did you get the survey?" I asked. "Yeah," he said casually. "Saw it. Any thoughts?" He shrugged. "Lines on paper don't always mean much." I stared at him. "Professional survey lines usually do." He laughed. Not a nervous laugh. Not an embarrassed laugh. The kind of laugh someone gives when they think they've already won. Then he said something I still remember almost word for word. "People use land for years, and eventually, it becomes theirs anyway." I knew exactly what he was implying. He wasn't talking about reality. He was talking about the myth people repeat when they think time magically creates ownership. Maybe he'd read something online. Maybe somebody gave him terrible advice. Either way, the message was clear. He wasn't planning to move anything. That conversation changed my mindset completely. Up until then, I'd treated the situation as a misunderstanding. After that, I started treating it as a decision. Brandon knew exactly what the survey showed. He simply didn't care. So I scheduled a consultation with a property attorney. The lawyer reviewed the documents, examined the survey, and listened to the entire story. When I finished, he leaned back and asked a simple question. "Do you want money or compliance?" "Compliance," I said immediately. He nodded. "Good. Because this is actually simpler than you think." That's when I learned something interesting. The workshop wasn't just crossing a property line. It also appeared to violate local setback requirements. In other words, even if the ownership dispute didn't exist, the location itself might still be a problem under municipal code. The lawyer explained that I didn't necessarily need a lawsuit. What I needed was an official review. So that's exactly what I requested. I filed a boundary complaint with the zoning department. Nothing dramatic. No courtroom. No television-worthy confrontation. Just paperwork. Then I waited. About 10 days later, 2 city inspectors arrived. One carried a measuring wheel. The other had a tablet loaded with maps and permit records. They spent nearly 2 hours examining everything. They measured the workshop. They reviewed property records. They photographed the fence. They compared survey data with permit information. I stayed mostly out of their way. Brandon, meanwhile, followed them around pretending to be helpful. At one point I heard him saying, "I'm sure it's just a misunderstanding." One of the inspectors responded, "That's why we're here." The following week, a certified notice appeared in Brandon's mailbox. I only knew because I saw him standing at the curb reading it. His face changed halfway through. That confident expression I'd seen for months disappeared. Later, I obtained a copy through public records. The city's findings were straightforward. The workshop permit itself was valid. The location was not. Because the structure crossed a property boundary and violated setback requirements, it was considered non-compliant. The notice ordered removal or relocation within 30 days. Suddenly Brandon wanted to talk. Funny how that works. For months, he'd ignored surveys, ignored conversations, ignored common sense. But once the city became involved, he showed up at my front door. I opened it and immediately noticed the difference. The swagger was gone. "Can we talk?" he asked. We sat on my porch. He started with compliments, then explanations, then excuses. According to him, the city was overreacting. The surveyors were being technical. The rules were confusing. Everybody was making a bigger deal out of this than necessary. I listened quietly. Eventually he got to the real reason he was there. "Maybe you could sign something," he said. "Just permission to leave everything where it is." There it was. The request he'd been building toward the entire conversation. I asked a simple question. "Are you offering to purchase that portion of the property?" He looked surprised. "No." "Then what exactly are you asking for?" "Just permission." I nodded slowly. "So you want to keep using my land permanently without buying it?" He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The silence answered for him. I declined. Politely. Firmly. The meeting ended a few minutes later. As he walked back toward his house, I remember feeling oddly calm. Not angry. Not triumphant. Just certain. For months, I'd given him opportunities to solve the problem voluntarily. Every single one had been ignored. Now the timeline belonged to the city. Day 20 arrived. Nothing changed. Day 25 arrived. Still nothing. The workshop remained exactly where it was. The fence remained exactly where it was. Brandon seemed convinced the deadline wasn't real. Then day 30 came and went. On day 31, the city issued fines. Daily fines. The kind that start small enough to ignore and then quietly become painful. Weeks passed. The penalties accumulated. I occasionally saw Brandon standing in his backyard staring at the workshop like a man watching a clock count down. Neighbors began hearing rumors. Some thought I was being unreasonable. Others thought Brandon had pushed too far. A few people stopped me while walking their dogs and asked what was happening. I rarely said much. The survey spoke for itself. The city records spoke for themselves. By the time day 45 arrived, the entire neighborhood knew something was coming. Nobody knew exactly when. Nobody knew exactly how. Then one cool morning, I heard the sound of diesel engines outside my window. I stepped onto my deck with a cup of coffee and saw a contractor's truck pulling into Brandon's driveway, followed by a trailer loaded with equipment. Workers climbed out wearing safety vests and hard hats. They weren't there to negotiate. They weren't there to measure. They were there to remove something. And judging by the expression on Brandon's face as he stood frozen beside the workshop, he had finally realized the same thing. I stood there on my deck that morning holding a coffee cup that had gone completely cold, watching a scene that honestly felt surreal. For months, Brandon had acted as though reality was negotiable, as though confidence could somehow override surveys, property records, and city regulations. Now a crew of contractors was about to demonstrate exactly how wrong that assumption was. The workers didn't waste time. One of them reviewed paperwork, while another walked the perimeter taking photographs. Then the dismantling began. First came the decorative trim, then sections of siding. Within an hour, the workshop that had looked so permanent was already starting to resemble a giant puzzle being taken apart in reverse. Brandon paced across his yard, making phone calls. Every few minutes he'd stop, gesture toward the structure, and shake his head in frustration. I couldn't hear the conversations, but I didn't need to. His body language told the story. He was looking for a solution that no longer existed. By midday, entire wall panels were stacked on trailers. Electrical fixtures were removed. Roofing sections disappeared one by one. The strange part wasn't watching the building come down. The strange part was realizing how quickly something that had caused months of stress could be erased in a single day. Then the fence came next. Workers pulled posts from the ground and tossed them into a pile. The clean, straight line that had started this entire mess vanished almost as quickly as it had appeared. By late afternoon, they were filling post holes, smoothing dirt, and restoring the area. It looked like someone was rewinding time. I remember looking across the open space behind my yard and seeing something I hadn't seen in nearly a year, the actual shape of my property. The original line. The original view. The original reality. Brandon barely spoke to anyone that day. At one point our eyes met across the yards. Neither of us waved. Neither of us smiled. There wasn't really anything left to say. The argument had ended weeks earlier. This was simply the consequence arriving on schedule. Over the following months, things slowly settled down. The neighborhood moved on to new gossip, new projects, new complaints. Life does that. People act like dramatic events leave permanent scars on communities, but most neighborhoods have surprisingly short memories. Brandon eventually sold the house and moved away. I heard different versions of why, but I never bothered confirming any of them. It wasn't my concern anymore. What stayed with me wasn't the victory. It wasn't even the satisfaction of being proven right. It was the lesson underneath all of it. Looking back, the workshop wasn't really the problem. The fence wasn't the problem either. The real problem was the moment someone decided that another person's boundaries didn't matter. Not just property boundaries, but personal ones. Because the truth is, I gave Brandon multiple opportunities to fix the situation. I approached him respectfully. I shared information. I offered cooperation. I avoided lawyers until I absolutely had to. Every step of the way, there was an off-ramp available. What surprised me most was how often people mistake kindness for weakness. They assume that if you're calm, you'll eventually give in. If you're reasonable, you'll eventually surrender. If you avoid conflict, you'll avoid consequences. But sometimes the strongest thing you can do is simply stand still and refuse to move. You don't have to scream. You don't have to threaten. You don't have to get revenge. Sometimes all you have to do is let the rules apply equally to everyone. And that's exactly what happened here. I didn't tear down Brandon's workshop. The city did. I didn't remove the fence. The city did. I didn't create the consequences. I simply stopped preventing them. Even now, every time I look out across my backyard, I think about how differently this story could have ended. If Brandon had moved the fence when I first mentioned it, we'd probably still be friendly neighbors. If he'd respected the survey, the workshop could have been relocated before the fines ever started. If he'd chosen cooperation over entitlement, none of this would have happened. Instead, he kept building on land that wasn't his and eventually watched the entire project disappear piece by piece. So now I'm curious what you think. Was I right to keep pushing until the city enforced the rules, or should I have signed a permission agreement and let him keep using the land? At what point does being a good neighbor become allowing someone to take advantage of you? Let me know your thoughts in the comments because I've heard strong arguments from both sides, and honestly, the debate is almost as interesting as the story itself. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who has ever dealt with a difficult neighbor. Trust me, you never really know where a property line dispute is headed until somebody starts building on the wrong side of it.